And, sorry about that. I'm having serious trouble with the internet connection. I just ask you to please be patient with me, and I will have to then just Frankenstein this back together at the end. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right into this. If you are having any trouble with the connection or any trouble, um, if you have any trouble with connection or if you're having any trouble with hearing me and hearing what I'm saying, you can just drop a message in the chat and I will see what I can do to fix it. So before we get into the essay itself, I want to discuss the different types of essay questions. So in the let me just admit everyone, and then somebody's mic is on. I'm going to turn it off. I hope you don't mind. I just need to find out who is the culprit. Let me see whose mic is on. Hi. Right, so let's minimize this. Okay, so the different types of essay questions that we get. So in history, we are very lucky because they only ask a question in 3 different types of ways. The first way is to what extent, and I use the word first way very loosely. It basically just means that these are the 3 ways. So the first way is to what extent, which is basically used to indicate the degree to which something exists or happens. We'll say something is true to an extent, to some extent, or to a certain extent, when something is partly but not completely true. So Annalisa, I'm just going to stop your video and stop your audio if you don't mind. Yes, who is this person that is raising a hand? I'm not sure how I answer this. Okay, so the person that is raising the hand, you can put on your mic and you can tell us what you want to ask. I found you. Okay, so you can speak if you would like.
Good afternoon.
504-415-1515. Can you share with us what you would like to ask?
Good afternoon, Simone. It's Mr. Hugo here.
Hi.
It's Mr. Hugo speaking.
Oh, hi, Mr. Hugo.
I just want you to tell everybody mics on mute because there's quite a number of people that are calling and we can hear them while you're trying to explain. So
All
we
right.
would appreciate it if everybody can put their cameras off and also then to put their mics on mute, please. That would really be helpful. And from my side, I would just want to say, as the history subject advisor in Metro South, a warm welcome to everybody that's joined us this afternoon. But also a big word of thank you to Ms. Neft and Ms. Lucille Dorcas and also Mr. Franz that will be doing the presentations for us. We really do appreciate it and thank you very much. That's all from me for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hugo, for that warm welcome. I know I sometimes get ahead of myself and I just jump into things without even welcoming people, but thank you for doing that. I'm just going to mute videos, mute mics and things like that. Don't feel offended if I mute you. It's just so that everybody can hear what I'm saying. Okay, so let's continue. So the different types of essay questions you get is to what extent. So they'll say, to what extent did the bus boycotts create changes in the civil rights movement? Or they might ask, do you agree that the march to Washington was the most important march of the civil rights movement? Or they might ask, critically discuss the various protests of the civil rights movement. And when we get those things, we don't know, what do they actually want us to do? So in questions where it says to what extent, you are basically looking at both sides of the story, but you'll notice when you look at both sides of the story that certain it leans more towards one side, or it leans more towards the other side. So it will be true maybe to an extent, but it's not completely true. So in other words, they might ask you, to what extent were the bus boycotts the spark of the civil rights movement? So they need oh, there's a person that doesn't have a mic on mute. Let me find you and I will mute you. Okay, so basically what this means is, yes, the bus boycotts were the start of the civil rights movement. So it is true to an extent, but there were also other causes. And then you can maybe speak about the schools that had to be desegregated, the Jim Crow laws, the things like that. And then when you answer a question like that, you would say, the bus boycotts were the spark of the civil rights movement, either depending on what you believe. It was either very much the start of the civil rights movement, or it was maybe just a small part of the whole. So it is true, but not completely true. So if a question is asking you to what extent, it essentially just means it's only true to a certain degree. It's not completely true. Then next, you've got the do you agree? I love these ones. These ones are so easy to answer, because the first thing you need to write, if you see that there's a do you agree, the first thing you need to write is yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree, or I disagree, or I agree with the statement. So it's very nice when you write your introduction, you've got your first line ready. It's also one of the easier things to answer, because when you get a do you agree question, so they might ask you, do you agree that the March to Washington was the most important march of the civil rights movement? Then you would say, well, it was important, but it wasn't that important. So then you'd say, yes, I agree, or no, I disagree. In this case, I personally disagree. So I would say, I disagree that the March to Washington was the most important march. In the case where you choose your side and you either agree or disagree with the statement, your line of argument needs to correlate to your position. So I'm using a very fancy word there, correlate, but all it means is that you have to use if you agree, your whole essay needs to prove that you agree. I've had situations in the past where learners, actually, sorry, I just need to mute that person's video quickly. There it is. Turn off that video. Okay. Right. So I've had situations in the past where I literally went and I tricked my kids and I told them, the sit-ins were the most important protest of the civil rights movement. And because they were so used to just saying, yes, I agree, yes, I agree, yes, I agree, they got caught. And then they said, yes, I agree that the sit-ins were the most important. But then when you read the essay, they spoke about all of the other boycotts. They spoke about the bus boycotts. They spoke about the March to Washington. They spoke about the Birmingham March. And I caught them, because now they say that the sit-ins were the most important, but in the essay, they're mentioning all the other protests. So obviously then the sit-ins was not the most important. So that's why I say your line of argument needs to correlate to your position. So you can't say something in the introduction and then it's not present within your entire essay. So that's the do you agree thing. They must just be careful. Sometimes they catch you out. You need to read the question very carefully. Here's another person. Can you just turn off your video, please? Thank you. Right. Ooh, oopsie. I skipped to the next thing, but I didn't finish. Okay. So then the last question you will get is critically discuss. Let me just mute that person. Just give me a second. Mute. And turn the video off. Okay, I think I must, for the next thing I do, I must take off this meeting room thing so that when we join, we all join all at once. So critically discuss is also a nice, easy one. It basically requires you to give your opinion or your verdict on whether an argument or set of research findings is accurate. This sometimes requires you to look at both sides of an argument. So you have to look at the positives and you have to look at the negatives. So they might say critically discuss the role of Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. Then you'd have to look at What is the good things he did? What was the bad things he did? What's things that he did that other people didn't do? Or what's the things that other people did that he didn't do? So with critically discuss, you are basically opening up that question and you are asking, how can I answer this? I'm going to look at both sides. I'm going to discuss this. Like you're sitting next to your teacher and you're actually saying, but Martin Luther King, well, he was responsible for this and this, but he wasn't responsible for that. So it's like a discussion. I don't know why this random mouse is thing. Anyway, so just to summarize, to what extent means how true is the statement? So is it very true or is it sort of true, but not completely? Do you agree? You just choose a side. You either choose the side that says, yes, I agree, or you choose the side that says, no, I disagree. And then you need to make sure that your line of argument relates to that. And then the last one is critically discuss, where you basically look at all sides of the argument and you see at the end what the truth is. Because, you know, as they say with history, there's always three sides, your side, my side, and the truth. So that's what critically discuss is all about. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so when it comes to writing an introduction, it takes 3 steps. So Ms. Dorkshus has explained this in the previous thing, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The 3 steps are stance, because this essay will discuss. So you'll get an essay question, and the first thing you must do is you must choose a side. So you either say, I agree, I disagree, to a great extent, to a lesser extent, or simply just repeating the question as an answer. I'll explain that in a bit more detail when we get to the questions. And then you've got because. You have to give reasons why you chose the side that you did. So if you agree, you need to give a short 1 sentence just to say why you agree. And then lastly, you finish off with this essay will discuss. And that's where you give a brief overview of what will be inside of your essay. Example, a list of topics that you will cover in your essay. So these are essay topics. I lifted them straight from past papers. So these were questions that students in the past had to write on. So the first one there is the sit-ins were the only form of non-violent protest that was successfully used by the civil rights activists in the 1960s to bring an end to segregation and discrimination in the United States of America. Do you agree with the statement? Support your line of argument with relevant evidence. So once again, there's that thing that I told you where you catch the children out, that word only, that catches kids. So now they read the sit-ins were a form of non-violent protest and they don't take note of that only. And then they say, yes, I agree, the sit-ins were the non-violent form of protest. But they weren't the only one. And that's how the examiner sometimes catches you out. So you just need to read your essay questions very carefully. Below that, we have Martin Luther King Jr. ended his I Have a Dream speech with the following words: free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. Critically discuss the statement by referring to the role and influence of Martin Luther Jr. in the civil rights movement. Now, what I've noticed in the past, they are not leaning towards Martin Luther King's role anymore. They used to do it in 2017, but since then they haven't used it much. When you answer a question like this, you'd obviously then answer it by saying, so there's that critically discuss. And I can't say I agree or disagree because they're not asking us to agree or disagree. So what we can do is we can just take this part that says the role and influence of Martin Luther King Jr. and we can have a statement on it. We repeat it as an answer. So we will say, Martin Luther King Jr. had a very big role in the civil rights movement. Or you could say Martin Luther King Jr. had a very small role in the civil rights movement. So that's what it means to critically discuss. You take that statement and you convert it into an answer. So it's not easy like the do you agree, where you literally just start with saying, yes, I agree, or no, I disagree. Here you actually need to take the statement and write it over as an answer. And then the last one here is the Montgomery bus boycott gave rise to the various forms of protest by Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement, which transformed the lives of ordinary African Americans. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Support your line of argument with relevant evidence. So then what you do is you take this statement, the Montgomery bus boycotts gave rise to all of the other protests, and then we say, do you think that is very true, partly true, or completely false? So we would say, it's very true, because without the bus boycotts, none of the other things would have happened. So then in our statement, we would say, I agree that the Montgomery bus boycott gave rise to the various forms of protest and transformed the lives of ordinary African Americans to a great extent. If you disagree, you would then say, I agree to a lesser extent. So it's quite similar to that, do you agree? It's just adding that little bit of difficulty on when you get to what extent. Right, so let's move along. All right, so let's zoom in on one of the topics. The topics we will be zooming in on is the sit-ins. So the sit-ins were the only form of non-violent protest that was successfully used by the civil rights activists in the 1960s to bring an end to segregation and discrimination in the United States of America. Do you agree with the statement? Support your line of argument with relevant evidence. So when you guys get in that exam room and you see that question, I want you to do this. I want you to go to your question with your highlighter in your hand and highlight all the words that stand out to you, that seem important to you. So in this case, I have circled the word sit-ins. Okay, so they want me to focus on the sit-ins, but here's this word only. They want me to tell them if the sit-ins were the only form of non-violent protest that was successfully. So now I know in my line of argument, I need to use this word successful, successful, successful. So keep that in the back of your mind. Used by civil rights activists in the 1960s. Why is the date important? Because you know, when your teacher did this work with you, she or he started before the 1960s. They told you about the whole history of slavery and the Jim Crow laws and the bus boycotts. Those things happened before the 1960s. But this particular essay question wants me to look at the 1960s specifically. And then it also says to bring an end to segregation and discrimination in the United States of America. So once again, that's a word that should appear in my line of argument. Therefore, this led to the end of segregation and discrimination. So now we've got our question word, which is, do you agree? So when we start our introduction, we are going to write either yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree. I'll let you think a little bit whether you agree or disagree with the statement. Okay, so this is basically what I just explained. Firstly, we need to underline the keywords in the question. I have highlighted them in red. And secondly, we need to evaluate the question words. This particular question wants us to agree or disagree. All right, so that is how it's going to look once we have highlighted. We're in the exam, we're sitting with our highlighter, we're sitting with our blue pen, we're either circling or underlining or highlighting these question words. So the sit-ins were the only successfully 1960s in segregation. Do you agree? So those words that I've highlighted in red are words that need to appear in your introduction. So at the end of the day, your introduction will look something like this. So the first thing I did in green, I wrote my stance, which was, I do not agree. You can also say, I disagree. that the sit-ins were the only form of non-violent protest in the 1960s that was successfully used to end segregation in the United States of America. So there you can see the words in red. They're coming directly from the question, and I'm putting it there in my introduction. Okay, but is that enough? Can we just write that and that's a 10 out of 10 introduction? No, that introduction is a very basic introduction. So we need to give it a little bit more oomph, put a little bit of masala spice on, put a little bit of sugar on that donut, and we'll say, why do we believe that? And when we say why we believe it, we will say, we have studied several other protests that were successful in ending segregation. For example, Birmingham, Freedom Rides, etc. And then you have the last step, which is this essay will discuss the various campaigns of the civil rights activists in ending segregation in the USA. So at the end, our introduction will look something like this. I do not agree that the sit-ins were the only form of non-violent protest in the 1960s that was successfully used to end segregation in the United States of America, because there were several other protests that were successful in ending segregation. For example, Birmingham, Freedom Rides, etc. This essay will discuss how the various campaigns of the civil rights activists were able to successfully end discrimination in the USA. So there's my stance. You can see I've underlined it in green and then I wrote it over in green. And then I'm using words from the question in my introduction, as you can see here, right? So now let's go on to the body of the essay. Before we get into the meat of the essay, we need to contextualize it. This means that we need to give the background of why the civil rights movement was needed. So background in your essay, when we mark it as markers, is usually only about 1 or maybe 2 bullets. So you don't need to give a whole page of background, which I tend to find with my own learners. They love Rosa Parks. In fact, they refer to this essay as the Rosa Parks essay. And sometimes when I get them to write this essay, there's always a few kids that write a whole 1 page of background. I'm telling you that is unnecessary, because background is only 1 bullet or 2 bullets in the memo. You can keep it very short and sweet. Okay. And since this particular essay only wants us to look at the protests and campaigns of the 60s, the bus boycotts, which happened in 1955, becomes background. So sometimes you'll get a question where the bus boycotts needs to be fully explained. But for this particular question, the bus boycotts joins in with the background. So 3 things must be discussed in the background of this particular essay: the origins of the civil rights movement, why did the civil rights movement start, the role of Martin Luther King, who was the leader of the civil rights movement, how did he rise to power, and then the last one, the bus boycott. So bus boycotts, like I say, it's not always, okay, it's not always, it's not always in your background. Sometimes it comes in your essay. So that's why I put a little star there. But because it's background, it doesn't need to be longer than about 5 to 7 lines. Okay, so let's have a look at the, let me just check something. Am I still in this meeting? Okay, cool. I am still in the meeting. I just panicked because all my things disappeared on the side. Okay, so this is the body of the essay. So we need to start with your background. So this is the background here. Even after the end of slavery in the USA, African Americans were still subjected to racist Jim Crow laws and the violence of the Ku Klux Klan. It was in this context that the civil rights movement emerged, with Martin Luther King Jr. as its leader. He set the tone of a non-violent movement inspired by the ideas of Gandhi. The first phase of the civil rights movement were the bus boycotts, which were successfully, so there's that word successfully that you saw in the introduction, able to end segregation on buses in the South. This inspired all the other campaigns that followed. So let's just go back one. You can see these are the three things that need to be in the introduction. In green, the origins of the civil rights movement. In yellow, the role of Martin Luther King. And in red, the bus boycotts. And then when we turn over to this side here, we can see in green, even after the end of slavery. In yellow, Martin Luther King Jr. And in red, the first phase of the civil rights movement. All right, so here's the hot tip. It's important to kiss your essay. Mwah! Show it some love and keep it simple, stupid. In other words, keep your argument clear and concise. What many learners tend to do is they end up telling a story instead of actually engaging with the question. So the whole hot tip with this essay, get to your point quickly. Don't write pages and pages and pages on one boycott. It's fine if you can bring that down to about 7 lines, 10 lines, get to the point quickly, avoid waffling or padding. So waffling meaning you're going off the topic, you're talking about things that are irrelevant, doesn't speak directly to the question. Padding, same story. It's just putting a bit of extra information in there that you don't actually need. That means telling a story. So with history essays, we want to avoid telling a story. We are arguing a point, a lawyer. All right, so this essay itself is a fairly easy essay as we only need to discuss the different types of protest campaigns that was used by the civil rights movement. So when I do this essay with my own students, I tell them what you do, you know all of your protests. If you are able to say what the aim of the protest was, what happened during the protest, and what was the results of the protest, you then have successfully, fully described that protest, and you will get your full mark for that paragraph. So what was that protest successful in doing? So let's have a look. How do we do that? So what I've got here, what your teachers should have given to you, I emailed it to them. This is the entire essay, sans the background and sans the bus boycotts, where we just did what I told you here. We just broke it down into the aim, what happened, and what was the results. So the first one there is the sit-ins. What was the aim of the sit-ins? These 4 students got at the whites only lunch counter. The aim is to desegregate. So they want to have black and white people coming to the same lunch counter. Then we have to say what happened. We say the sit-in spread all across the segregated South. Black and white students formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to support the civil rights movement. And there was massive media attention, which led to sit-ins all throughout the country. You can also mention the wade-ins that they did at the beaches, the read-ins that they did at libraries, etc., etc. That's just more examples that you can use. This has been very much boiled down to the basic what needs to be in the essay. All right, then we've got the result. And what was the result of the sit-ins? The result was that 6 lunch counters in Nashville changed their policy and desegregated their counters. There was also the added result that some beaches, some restaurants, some libraries also started to segregate. But what you need to know with this particular protest was that even though some were desegregating, it wasn't like a law. So that means that other people were still following the racist Jim Crow laws and still not allowing people. But it did lead to some changes because some of the places desegregated. The next thing that we have is the freedom rides. Let me just mute that person. Okay, so the freedom rides was in 1961. So you will have noticed I wrote the protests all in order as well. So we've got the Congress of Racial Equality. that sat in buses and traveled from the north to the deep south to test the laws prohibiting or forbidding segregation on the national bus system. So with the bus boycotts, you will remember laws were passed to say that segregations on buses is not allowed. But this didn't actually happen in real life. So when these freedom riders went on their little trip from the north to the south, they were attacked by mobs, bombed, thrown in jail. And when they called the police to help them, the police just stood aside and didn't actually do anything. This led to many more people volunteering to be part of the freedom rides, and President Kennedy was forced to order federal marshals to protect them. So basically, the president was forced to get involved. So what was the result of the freedom riders? Did they have any success? So the success that they had was that tough new laws were introduced which officially desegregated all interstate public facilities. So if you're going from one state to another, the laws are not different now. Now the laws are going to be the same. All buses need to be desegregated. So it kind of rides on that wave of the bus boycotts and just make sure that it is fully integrated. Next, we've got the Birmingham campaign. I always think of this one as the most important one in your essay because this one leads to that big act, the Civil Rights Act. So it was organized, so the aim, organized by the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to bring attention to the integration efforts of African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama. So Birmingham, Alabama, most racist city in the South. They actually called it Bombingham because of all the bombs that went off. The Ku Klux Klan used to burn crosses on people's lawns and things like that. So Martin Luther King actually targets the Birmingham city for desegregation. And he organizes boycotts of the businesses there. They organize marches in there. And they have mass demonstrations where everyone is just protesting in Birmingham. Unfortunately, their demonstrations were met with violence from the police. A lot of people got arrested. And then Martin Luther King decided to enlist the help of children. So he wanted to show that because the police there were so racist, they would attack even little children. And that was all recorded on TV. I like to use the word, but you don't use it, okay? But I like to use the word that it went viral. So you can imagine there's a video of the police hurting and dealing with children with violence, putting dogs on children, using water cannons on children. And this goes on TV. And everyone's like, Haibo? No, that's not right. And then it basically forced the president into action. So President Kennedy had to go on TV and actually say that racial segregation is a moral issue, meaning the president himself is realizing you cannot continue with racism in America. It's not working. So what is the result of the Birmingham campaign? On the 10th of May, 1963, city businesses and municipality announced that municipal facilities will be desegregated. So all the businesses in Birmingham started to desegregate. And then we've got the whammy. President Kennedy puts in place, or he starts talking about the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So he mentions it. He doesn't actually get to enact it because he is unfortunately assassinated before he gets to do that. But his successor, Lyndon Johnson, takes this act and makes sure that it gets passed. And why is this such a big deal? Because the Civil Rights Act basically said that every single state in America must ban discrimination and segregation. So those Jim Crow laws cannot be used in any country or in any state in America. And it also is banned discrimination in any public facilities. Then we've got the March to Washington, where 250,000 people took part in a non-racial, non-violent march to Washington to demand full equality and jobs. What happened there? Martin Luther King Jr. gave his very famous I Have a Dream speech, and this brought many more people on board with the civil rights movement. They saw this as a part, it's not out there to attack white people or to attack black people. We are all working together. And so it greatly influenced national opinion, brought all Americans together. So the march is credited with helping to pass the Civil Rights Act, and it happened also before the Selma March, which led to the Voting Rights Act. Then you've got the Freedom Summer, which happened in 1964. The aim of that was that thousands of activists and volunteers worked to register African Americans in Mississippi and teach in freedom schools. So one of the problems that African Americans faced is that even though they were technically allowed to vote, when they went to vote, they actually got attacked by white mobs, and they had to fill in this literacy test, which was designed to make them fail so that they weren't allowed to vote. So these white and black people, volunteers, came to Mississippi, and they taught people how to pass this test so that they can go and vote. And they also protected people. So they started like sort of like a walking bus, and they would protect people when they went to go and vote. However, as is usually the case, they were met with violence from white segregationist mobs and police officers. 2 white students and 1 African American were killed. So what was the result of Freedom Summer? It was successful because it managed to register 17,000 black residents to vote. However, when the time came to actually vote, only 1,200 people actually went to go and vote. So you are registered to vote, but only 1,200 actually voted. Then you've got the Selma to Montgomery. What's the aim? To demand that African Americans be allowed to register to vote. What happened? There were 3 attempts to go over this bridge, and the police attacked the non-violent demonstrators, leading to an event called Bloody Sunday. And this created mass support from across the country. And the new president, after Kennedy passed away, President Johnson, he was pressurized to pass the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So the Voting Rights Act basically banned those literacy tests, which stopped black people from registering as voters, and allowed the civil rights movement to finally completely achieve equality before the law. So I would argue, if we were to rate the protest from most important to least important, Birmingham would be the top, and then we'd have the Selma to Montgomery, which would be the second one. All right, so let's, sorry, my kids are just coming out of another extra lesson. Okay, so the hot tip here is with this essay, the result of the campaign is almost always, okay, let me just quiet this down for a second, sorry. All right, so the hot tip for this essay is that the result of the campaign. So remember I said you always have to discuss the aim, you have to discuss what happened and what is the result. So the result, the nice part is, it's always desegregation. So what's the result of the sit-ins? Lunch counters were desegregated. What's the result of the freedom rides? Buses, interstate buses were desegregated. What's the result of the Birmingham campaign? All public facilities were desegregated. What's the result of the March to Washington? Okay, that one didn't lead to desegregation, but it did bring awareness to the issues that African Americans were facing. So the results of the campaign is almost always that it led to desegregation, or it passed laws banning discrimination, or it brought awareness to the issues that African Americans are facing. So you will always have that with you when you go and you write, and you remember that aim, what happened, result. You know the result will be one of these 3 things. All right, so let's discuss the PEEL format. So now that we know the content, we need to work on our presentation. You can't just throw facts on the table and expect to win the case. You need to have a line of argument, and this is where the PEEL format comes in. All right, so what is the PEEL format? It means you start with a point, which is one sentence that tells the examiner what the paragraph will be about. Example, one of the campaigns used by civil rights activists in the 1960s was the sit-ins. Then you must explain. So that's where we do that aim. So in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 students staged a sit-in at the whites-only lunch counter with the aim of desegregating it. Then we give an example. Sit-ins spread all across the segregated South. Black and white students formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to support the civil rights movement. Massive media attention led to sit-ins all throughout the country. 6 lunch counters in Nashville changed their policy and desegregated their counters. Then we have our line of argument. So this is something that our kids always get confused with. Those things that you highlighted in red when you saw the question for the first time, that's the things that needs to appear in your line of argument. So for example, this shows that the sit-ins were one of the protest campaigns that were successful in ending discrimination. However, it was not the only one. So this is an example of the correct answer where we follow the PEEL system. So you can see over there is our point. Here is our explanation. Here is our example. And there is our link or our line of argument, tying it back to the question. So you'll see that, I'll just read the line of argument for you. This shows that the sit-ins were one of the protest campaigns that were successful. When you read the question, it asked you successful. So now I'm using it in my line of argument. And then in ending discrimination. Discrimination was in the question. So I'm using it again in my line of argument. However, it was not the only one. So that ties back to that idea of agreeing or disagreeing. So the question was asking us, do you agree that the sit-ins were the only form of protest that was successful? And now I'm saying in my line of argument, yes, the sit-ins did end discrimination, but it was not the only one. And then you basically just do that all throughout the entire essay. So here you see, I'm just going to read it out, but as I read it, just take note of where the point, explain, example, and link is. Another campaign used by the civil rights activists were the Freedom Rides. The Congress of Racial Equality sat in buses and traveled from the north to the deep south to test new laws that forbid segregation on the buses. The Freedom Riders were attacked by mobs, bombed, thrown in jail, and not protected by local police. Thousands volunteered, and President Kennedy was forced to order federal marshals to protect the Freedom Riders. Tough new legislation was introduced by the federal order on the 1st of November 1961, which officially desegregated all interstate public facilities. Therefore, the Freedom Riders were able to end segregation on interstate public facilities, proving that the sit-ins were not the only campaign to achieve success. So there you see that word desegregation, that result. Here you see your explanation and examples, and there's your point. Now, a lot of kids don't like writing dates. So if you are somebody that can't remember dates, you can leave that out completely. And then you can just say that tough new legislation officially desegregated all interstate public facilities. Okay? So, and another thing you can do if you can't remember a date, you can say in the 1960s. So instead of saying 1st November 1961, you can just say in the 1960s, tough new legislation desegregated public facilities. So here's another one. Civil rights activists also used various campaigns and marches to end discrimination, such as the campaign in Birmingham. So that's my point. It was organized in early 1963 by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to bring attention to the integration efforts of African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama. Mass demonstrations, including a children's march, was met with violent reactions from the police. President Kennedy stated on TV that racial segregation was a moral issue. On the 10th of May, 1963, city businesses and municipalities announced that municipal facilities would be desegregated. Thanks to this campaign, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed and stopped discrimination and segregation in employment and all public facilities. As a result, This campaign was also successful in ending discrimination in the USA. So there we go. The 1964 Civil Rights Act must be in this paragraph because that is one of the big successes. Remember, we're trying to prove that all of this was successful. So you must just remember to do that. And then here's the next one. Civil rights activists also organized a march to the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. That's my point. 250,000 people took part in the non-racial, non-violent march to Washington to demand full equality and jobs. That's my explanation. Martin Luther King Jr. gave the I Have a Dream speech. That's my example. The rising tide of civil rights agitation greatly influenced national opinion. The march is credited with helping to pass the Civil Rights Act and was therefore successful in ending segregation in the USA, in addition to other protests like the sit-ins. And then another one, even though African Americans had attained civil rights, voting rights was still an issue. Therefore, Freedom Summer was necessary. Thousands of activists and volunteers worked to register African Americans in Mississippi and teach in freedom schools. That's my explanation. They met with violence from white segregationist mob and police officers. That's my example. 2 white students and 1 African American were killed. Freedom Summer was successful, so there's our link, because it managed to register 17,000 Black residents to vote. However, only 1,200 African Americans actually managed to vote. This proves that Freedom Summer was another campaign that helped end segregation in the USA. And then there's the last one. The final campaign organized by civil rights activists was the March from Selma to Montgomery. They demanded that African Americans be allowed to register to vote. After 3 attempts, brutal police attacks on nonviolent demonstrators, Bloody Sunday, and the mass support from across the country reached Montgomery, and President Johnson was pressurized to pass the Voting Rights Act, which banned literacy tests which had been put in place to prevent Black people from registering as voters. It is clear to see that this march was also successful in ending discrimination in the 1960s. Whew, that's a lot. Now we're finally on the conclusion. So a conclusion doesn't need to be longer than about 5 lines. The purpose is simply to tie your argument together. Think about it like making a closing argument to a judge to prove your point beyond reasonable doubt. So many kids get stuck and they ask, Miss, how do I start the conclusion? You can always use these words: in conclusion, as a result, or therefore. And then you basically summarize your essay in about 2 or 3 lines, where you say there were many campaigns used by civil rights activists to end discrimination, such as the Freedom Rides, the Birmingham Campaign, the Selma March, etc. And then you refer back to the question in your last line, where you say this proves that the sit-ins were not the only campaign used by the civil rights activists to end segregation in the 1960s. So it's just that little punch to tell the examiner, look here, there, I proved your statement. Here it is. Bam, you can't say anything to me. Right. So for the visual learners, we are almost done. I'm just going to wrap up really quickly. Can you guess the protest? So here you see a big guy with a message at the back saying racism, see a Black lady sitting in the bus, and the guy says, I told you to move to the back of the bus. Boom, 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 bus boycotts. Here we see a guy, his name is actually Diamond Dion, they called him, Crazy Dion. And he actually sat in a lunch counter all by himself. You can see the white people are not looking at him very happily. Therefore, this one is the bum, 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 bum sit-ins. The next one, you can see people saying freedom's wheels are rolling in segregation. The law of the land is our demand. So we can tell that this is the bus, not the bus boycotts, the freedom rides. Here we've got a little girl and she's busy protesting, and the police officer is asking her, what do you want? And she says, freedom. Which protest is this? When do we mention children? Birmingham. So this is Birmingham. This one with voter literacy tests, Freedom Summer. We March with Selma. If you guys watched it on Sunday, I think it came on ETV, the Selma movie. For visual learners, can you guess the protest? It's the march from Selma to Montgomery. All right, so woo, we are done, people. If there's anything you would like to know, you can raise your hand or you can just email me. My email address is in the picture over here. I hope this helps you and good luck going forward. So I'm going to give you a few minutes just if you want to raise your hand and ask a question. I did kind of rush towards the end because I want to be done now. It's 4 o'clock. Oh my word. So please ask a question. If you don't ask in the next 5 minutes, I'm ending the meeting. All right, so there's no questions. Thank you so much. I will be putting this up on YouTube and Mr. Hugo will then distribute it. Thank you very much and I hope you enjoy your day further. Bye.